Thank you for your interest in preventing violence and harassment in the workplace. The purpose of this educational video is to provide general basic knowledge of the workplace violence and harassment regulations and what resources Yukon Workers' Compensation Health and Safety Board has available. At WVHP, our mandate is to prevent disability. We do that through promoting workplace safety, providing compensation support to injured workers to recover and return to work safely. At WCB, we've got three main client-focused branches: Claimant Services, Employer Services, and Occupational Health and Safety, known as OH&S. Today, we're going to be focusing on the work of OH&S. They are responsible for enforcing the Workplace Violence and Harassment Prevention Regulation. The role of OH&S is to administer and enforce the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or OHSA, in order to promote workplace safety in Yukon. Sometimes that's through enforcement activities like inspections and investigations, and sometimes it's providing information about health and safety management for workplaces, just like what we're doing here today. The Violence and Harassment Prevention Regulation, which sets out the general requirements for the prevention of violence and harassment in the workplace, becomes law on September 4th, 2021. All workplaces need to be ready for this. To be ready for the regulation to come into force, there are some new requirements you should be aware of. We're going to be discussing those today in this video. If you'd like to familiarize yourself with the regulations, then visit Yukonregs.ca. At this website, you'll find a link to the amendment to Part 1, as well as the new Part 19, Violence and Harassment Prevention. And if you'd like a paper version of our revised second edition regulation books, they're available at our Whitehorse office, which is located at 401 Strickland Street on the corner of 4th Avenue in Whitehorse, Yukon. This is what they look like. They're pretty big. Today, I will be referencing information available in our Workplace Violence and Harassment Prevention Guide. This guide provides information in plain language, as well as templates, checklists, and other useful tools. You're not required to use the templates of the guide, as they're here as a resource and to support you. You can download this from our website or pick up a copy at our office at 401 Strickland Street. Today, we're going to talk about workplace hazards, workplace violence and harassment, and requirements of new violence and harassment prevention regulation, the role of occupational health and safety officers, and other supports that are available. The Occupational Health and Safety Act requires workplace parties to protect workers and other persons from hazards to health and safety, prevent injuries and death, ensure work procedures, techniques, and policies are adopted and used to prevent or reduce risk of injury. And everyone has a role to play in workplace safety, as workplace safety is a shared responsibility. More specifically, employers must ensure workers are not subject to or participate in violence or harassment. Supervisors must ensure workers under their supervision are not subject to violence or harassment. And workers must refrain from causing or participating in violence and harassment. Before we begin discussing the requirements of the legislation, let's begin by defining violence and harassment. Workplace violence is defined as the exercise of actual physical force towards a worker that causes injury or is likely to cause injury to a worker. And that includes threatening statements made or conduct that gives a worker reasonable cause to believe they're at risk of injury. And it also includes the threat or attempt to commit violence. Some examples could be physical attack or aggression, threatening behavior, verbal or written threats, sexual violence, or domestic violence. And we can't have a conversation about workplace violence and harassment without discussing domestic violence. Domestic violence is a behavior by a person to gain power and control over another person with whom they have had or had a personal relationship. Domestic violence can enter a workplace and is no longer only a personal issue when a person attempts to harass, stalk, threaten, or injure another person at work. It can put the worker and the entire workplace at risk. When an employer is aware that a worker is or is likely to be exposed to domestic violence at the workplace, the employer must take reasonable precautions to protect the worker and any other persons at the workplace likely to be affected. We don't expect employers to get involved in a worker's personal life. However, an employer needs to have a structure in place that assesses the risk and allows for reporting of domestic violence. And workers need to be aware that they can safely disclose, and they need to know what actions will be taken. Harassment is a workplace hazard and must be considered during a hazard assessment. Generally, harassment is defined as bullying or objectionable comments or behavior that occurs in a workplace against a worker that the person knows or ought to know is likely to be unwelcome, and that adversely affects the worker's physical or psychological health and safety. This includes objectionable behavior relating to a worker's sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. Here are some examples of workplace harassment. However, not every incident of unpleasant interactions, disrespectful behavior, or conflict is necessarily harassment, although it may develop into a harassment or violence. It is not harassment when managers and supervisors are taking reasonable actions while managing and directing workers. These would be actions considered to be part of the manager's duties, which could include giving instructions, changing a worker's job duties, determining schedules and workloads, conducting performance evaluations, taking disciplinary action, or discussing the best way to work with a coworker. There are some specific requirements for the new regulation. We're going to expand on all of these today in this video, but here's the overview. The new regulations require all employers to conduct hazard assessments to identify existing and potential hazards in the workplace. 2, develop and implement a policy for the prevention of violence and harassment. 3, develop procedures to accompany the policy. 4, train their workers on hazard assessment and policies and procedures. Additionally, number 5, all employers need to investigate complaints or incidents of violence and harassment in an appropriate manner, which are then shared with all relevant parties while maintaining confidentiality. 6, if an employer becomes aware of domestic violence in the workplace, the employer must take reasonable precautions to protect the person and others in the workplace. And 7, all employers need to review their policies and procedures at least every 3 years. It should be noted that violence and harassment are not new hazards for workplaces, and it's not a new requirement to protect workers and others from the risk of injury from hazards such as violence and harassment. A workplace hazard is a situation, thing, or condition that may expose a person to a risk of injury, including violence and harassment. This can range anywhere from unsafe lifting, unmanaged noise levels, violence from customers, or spreading malicious gossip amongst coworkers. Violence and harassment are workplace hazards that can cause physical and psychological injuries. They can occur in any workplace, and they must be considered during a hazard assessment. New amendments to the OH&S regulations require employers to conduct hazard assessments in the workplace. Hazard assessments are a core part of every health and safety management system. They allow the employer to focus their efforts in the right areas and develop worker training, inspections, emergency response plans, etc., specific to the hazards on their worksite. They need to take into consideration the worker's experience, the location of the workplace, the likelihood that the hazard presents to a risk of injury. And when hazards are identified, they must be eliminated. And if that's not possible, they must be controlled through engineering, such as barriers, accessible exits, guards, camera placements, or administrative procedures, such as policies and procedures. The findings must be documented from the hazard assessment, and from these findings, the policies and procedures can be developed. We've developed a hazard assessment and control handbook for everyone's use. This resource really fleshes out the step-by-step hazard assessment process. Like our other guides, you can download it from our website or pick up a copy at our office. Changes to Part 1 General of the OH&S regulations require employers to develop policies and procedures for the prevention of injuries in general. In addition, the violence and harassment regulation requires employers to develop and implement a policy for the prevention of violence and harassment. The policy must be in writing and be readily accessible for workers. The policy sets the framework for proactive prevention and management and sets the expectation that violence and harassment are not tolerated in the workplace. The workplace policy must include some key statements. Violence and harassment is prohibited. Workers are entitled to employment free of violence and harassment. The employer's commitment to eliminate or control the risks of violence and harassment. The worker's right to report. The worker's right to privacy and confidentiality. And the worker's right to pursue any other available legal remedies, such as contacting the Human Rights Commission or the RCMP for support. All employers must also have written procedures that describe what everyone in the workplace must do to prevent violence and harassment from causing harm. The written procedures must explain measures an employer is to take to eliminate and control violence and harassment, how a worker makes a complaint to or against their employer, the investigation process for both the complainant and person conducting the investigation, the process for informing the parties of the investigation results, how you're going to apply corrective actions, and what does post-incident treatment look like for those affected. And workers must receive training on all procedures. What's unique about this regulation is that a team approach is necessary when doing the assessments, and it should involve the Joint Health and Safety Committee, if there is one, or the Worker Health and Safety Representative, workers and employer. Committees and worker representatives provide support, advice, and recommendations to the employer in their health and safety management systems. Committees are required for employers with 20 or more workers, and a worker health and safety representative is required in some workplaces with smaller number of workers. Policies and procedures should be reviewed regularly, and in this case, at least every 3 years. Do employers and supervisors understand the procedures? Do they know what to do? Are the procedures working? And if the procedures aren't working, make the necessary changes. If workers haven't had to use the procedure, consider giving them a scenario to practice using it and then get their feedback about how the procedure is working. When a workplace has experienced a violence and harassment incident, it needs to be reported internally. Check out our reporting form template, which is available in the guide and separately in Word format, and it can be modified for your use. An employer must investigate complaints and incidents of violence and harassment at their workplace and take action to address it and prevent it from happening again. I like to think of an investigation as studying an incident. It's kind of like a puzzle, but the pieces are not supplied. You need to collect them and put them together. You want to know why something happened, how it happened, who was involved, and where it happened. The Workplace Violence and Harassment Prevention Regulation states that the investigation must be conducted by an impartial person who has the knowledge, experience, or other qualifications required to conduct it. The employer should ensure that someone at the workplace has the training to conduct an investigation. The results of the investigation should be documented and should outline the incident, be shared only with the involved persons, always maintain confidentiality, and recommend corrective actions. It should be noted that not all investigations are big, and likely the sooner something is reported, the less involved the investigation will need to be. In our guide, we have a few pages with information about the basics of investigations and a reporting template. Yukon Workers' Compensation Health and Safety Board will engage in an internal investigation for a variety of reasons. If requested, an employer must be prepared to provide the investigation reports they create to Occupational Health and Safety. If OH&S reviews the employer's investigation and finds that it was not done adequately, an OH&S officer can order an investigation to be done by a qualified, impartial person at the employer's expense. But this could be mitigated by training a worker to conduct investigations. To clarify the role of occupational health and safety officers in workplace violence and harassment investigation, here's an outline of what they can and cannot do. The role of occupational health and safety is to determine if the parties have met their obligations under the OHSA and regulations. An officer's role is to determine whether workplaces are safe, hazard assessments have been done, the required policies and procedures are developed, and are they adequate? The workers receive training on the policies and procedures. Policies and procedures are being followed. Are they reporting and investigating? Investigations are being done and are appropriate. And an OH&S officer may write orders, which are legal directives or instructions of what you have to do to comply with the regulations. OH&S officers cannot resolve or mediate specific allegations of harassment in the workplace. They can't advocate for any party. They can't impose disciplinary measures. They can't order individual remedies, such as monetary compensation to individuals who experience violence or harassment in the workplace. And they can't interfere with reasonable management practices which do not contravene the OH&S Act or regulations. If a worker feels that they have suffered a physical or psychological injury due to workplace violence or harassment, they can apply for a claim with WVHP. Here's the reporting process. The worker must report the injury to their employer. The employer must report injury to WVHP by filling out an employer's report of injury. And if the worker wants to file a claim, the worker fills out the worker's report of injury and submits it to WVHP. In the case of a psychological injury, the diagnosis must meet the criteria described in the most recent edition of the DSM and come from a psychologist or psychiatrist. It is important to point out that normal pressures and tensions of employment, such as the normal expectations of the work and actions such as hiring, firing, promotions, demotions, layoff, transfers, workload fluctuations, will not give rise to a compensatable injury. Each claim is decided on its own merits and always on a case-by-case basis. Each case has its own variables. If you have questions, please contact a case manager at Yukon Workers' Compensation Health and Safety Board. So what do workers need to know about the new regulation? They need to know that violence and harassment are prohibited. Workers have a right to a workplace free of violence and harassment. Violence and harassment are hazards in the workplace. There are policies and procedures in place, and they should be trained on them and know where to find them. They need to know how to report violence or harassment and what to expect after reporting. They need to know that the employer has an obligation to ensure confidentiality and how to report an injury and file a claim in the event of an injury. An employer must ensure that workers are trained in the recognition of violence and harassment, hazard identification, policies, procedures, and measures that eliminate or control violence and harassment, appropriate responses to violence and harassment, procedures for reporting, investigating, and documenting incidents. In addition, the amendments require an employer to maintain records of training provided to workers. All of our resources can be found on our website at wcb.yk.ca, or you can obtain a printed copy of our guide at WVHP office located on Strickland Street and 4th Avenue. There are templates available for policies, procedures, reporting forms, investigation reports, and all these templates are available in the guide as well as in separate Word documents that you can modify and use for your own workplace. Additionally, if you want to make sure you are following the requirements, we have a workplace roles and responsibilities checklist and due diligence checklist available in the guide. We've also created safety talks, which are short documents that can be used during staff meetings to generate safety conversations and discussions. The talks have definitions, suggestions, and questions that can be posed to staff. These listed talks on this page are now available on our website for you to download. We also have a simple PowerPoint template available for workplaces to use. The template allows you to personalize your workplace violence and harassment prevention information to educate staff. The template is just text, so it's easy to download and it's easy to modify for your workplace. And like all of our other resources, this is a suggested resource that you can adapt for your workplace needs. If you enjoyed this video, you can register on our website to join the same session live on Zoom. The session allows you to ask questions to an occupational health and safety officer. We have dates available on our website. Additionally, you can book to have a speaker from WVHP come to your workplace in person or remotely to deliver this session to your staff or coworkers. All sessions are free and they're aimed towards employers, supervisors, and workers. We have partnered with the University of Fredericton to offer their psychological health and safety course at a 70% discount. The course aims to teach participants how to assess and address issues that have an impact on the mental health of employees, as well as understand psychological health and safety concepts and their roles in keeping organizations psychologically safe and healthy. The course would be useful for all Yukoners and is available for all Yukoners. They're fully online with flexible delivery methods. The Northern Safety Network Yukon is offering a half-day online training on workplace violence and harassment. It goes more into depth on the regulations and offers some great case studies to get you thinking. If you want some more information, check out this phone number or email us at this email address, or check out our website for more resources and supports. We're here to support you. We want to make sure that your workplace is ready for these new regulations coming into effect. Thanks for watching.